Do you think if I gave these to children coming to my door this Halloween that I would get egged?
Almost certainly.
Yeah. So this week I'm going to be looking at soul cakes, the first ever Halloween food, how to cook them and what they taste like. So I've been looking at the history of Halloween food. I came across a really interesting 18th century recipe for pumpkin wine. Sounds like it could be disgusting. There was also a recipe for apple bobbing punch from the 20th century, which really just sounds like an excuse to get drunk at a kid's party. So what were soul cakes? Soul cakes are one of the first ever foods that we associate with Halloween. They go right back to early pagan festivals that eventually over time morphed into Halloween as you and I know it today. So I'm going to recreate them based on one of the earliest recorded versions of the recipe we have from the 17th century. We have a classic unicorn stew conundrum to start us off, because the first line of this recipe says, take flour and sugar. There's no mention of quantity or anything. This feels a little bit like a pagan version of the bake-off challenge. Instead of Prue and Paul, I've got a couple of druids standing over on my shoulder just judging my soul cakes. This can only go brilliantly or completely tits up. One thing I found really interesting while researching this is that soul cakes seem to be one of the earliest incarnations of the Jaffa cake debate, in that no one is really sure if they're supposed to be a biscuit or a cake. The next stage of the recipe calls you to add to your mix nutmeg and cloves and mace and sweet butter and sack and a little ale barm. Cool. So we're starting off with the nutmeg, a little bit of a grating in, probably about half a teaspoon, bit of mace. So we then reach for our authentic pagan spice grinder, chuck in some cloves. Grab your smallest sieve. You want to get out the more toothsome bits. So at this point, we need to talk a little bit about ale barm. The original method of making yeasted bread in Britain originated as a byproduct of ale making. During the production of traditional ale, a foamy layer of yeast would collect on the top, which they would scrape off and then mix in to leaven their bread. This was commonly referred to as barm. As I don't brew my own ale, and my history of cooking with ale is fairly dubious, when making cock ale, I think it's really vital that you have a nice frothy head on it. There are a couple of ways that you can make ale barm at home. So what you can do is mix a teaspoon of active yeast with a couple of tablespoons of flour, a teaspoon of sugar, and a cup of ale. Gonna mix this together. Gonna leave this for about 10 to 15 minutes. So what does Halloween have to do with soul cakes? As many people know, Halloween owes many of its traditions to pagan festivals originally. So before Christianity had set up shop in Britain, there was an ancient Gaelic festival called Samhain. Might be mispronouncing that, but let's just proceed with a degree of undeserved confidence. And during Samhain, people would gather together to light bonfires, offer sacrifices, and pay homage to the dead. All this at a time just building up to winter, which was associated with death in itself. Some celebrations saw pagans dressing up in costumes made of animal skin to ward off evil spirits. Part of the reason we associate Halloween with being a spooky season is because at this exact time, folklore from Samhain said that the time of year created a bit of a rift in between reality where the spirit world and the real world came together. And basically this would mean that all the spirits got set free. And we also get our first account of soul cakes from this period. Some say that they were baked on bonfires and you would hand out the burnt one, and whoever got the burnt one would be offered up as a ritual sacrifice. Not a huge incentive to go bobbing for cakes in a fire, but there we go. Or soul cakes may have been tossed out into the wilderness to appease evil spirits. So one of the things the recipe also calls for is a little bit of sack. So we've got sherry, next best thing, because we've not raided Spain. I'm actually going to skip ahead a bit here. The sign off for this recipe says that if you want, you can add a little bit of saffron to it. So I'm going to put a little bit of saffron in the I was going to say shack. Looks like I'm making a really gritty salad dressing. So at this point we're told to add some sweet butter, which is really just an older term for unsalted butter. Going to get my hands in, crumble this up a bit. Let's just try giving this a little bit of a pour, bringing it slowly together. Ah, it smells really malted and actually quite interesting. So then your instructions are to work it all together, which again, isn't vague at all. So by the 8th century, around the time that Christianity had set up shop in Britain, soul cakes were being given to beggars who came around on All Souls' Eve. So the Catholic Church had brought with them the tradition of All Hallows' Eve, which was a time for Christians to honour and remember their lost ones, including saints and martyrs, for example. So a new tradition called souling began. So the cake traditions from pagan festivals found a new spiritual purpose, being given out as alms to the poor. I'm gonna get a spoon, just like the pagans did. So what would happen was that beggars and sometimes children would go from house to house and they would offer to say a prayer or sing a song to families in honor of their lost ones. At this point in history, the concept of purgatory was still a very strongly held belief. So any prayers said in honor of that person's loved one really served a strong purpose in helping them move out of purgatory and into the kingdom of heaven. So in return for a prayer and a kind word, families would give these beggars soul cakes. What would happen was the bakers would actually mark the soul cakes with a cross to symbolize that they were alms for the poor, religious gifts. So if you're thinking that this sounds suspiciously like trick-or-treating, ding ding ding, pretty much where that begins. The only real difference being that souling was trick-or-treating where you gave something back. So instead of asking for sweets and egging someone's house when they didn't give you them, you were giving them peace for their loved ones in the afterlife and getting a cake as a result. So at this point we've got the wonderful description of make them into little cakes. There we go. So there's a theory that the etymology of soul cakes come from a corruption of wassail. Wassailing was where people would go into orchards and have a drink and a dance and try to basically pray for a good harvest the next year. It then tells us to bake them. Maybe we can add some saffron, which we've already done with the sherry, and put in some fruit. I'm not going to cut across into anything. Fairly sure if I did, I'd melt. This is about as precise as I get. Using the tweezers that I usually reserve for taking out fish bones to give a lovely fruity cross into my soul cake. So if I sang someone a song or said a prayer for them and they gave me some of these, I'm not entirely sure if I'd feel it was a fair transaction. It just tells us to bake them, no instructions. Thank you, Pagan Paul Hollywood. Shall we give it, what, 10 minutes, 15 minutes? I don't know, I'm making this up. I've just realised that completely inadvertently we cooked these for 13 minutes. I know that I'm really lame. So after 13 minutes of baking, we are left with soul cakes, or at least an Elizabethan recipe for a pagan treat. It smells really tasty, but very bready. Let's see if we can save my soul. Yeah, it's tasty. Needs more fruit woven into it and probably a bit more sugar. But that's more about my ratios than anything. I'm not sure if this would ward off an evil spirit or if it would just make them even angrier. Bit more booze, bit more sugar, mix the fruit in as well as on top, and I think you've got a pretty good recipe for a soul cake. In summary, pretty tasty. I'd still take a fun-sized Mars bar over them, but thanks, pagans. Thanks so much for watching. Do consider subscribing for more food history and let me know in the comments if you've got something else you'd like to see me recreate from history.